Good day, and today we're going to do the life and literature in the medieval period. So what was it like first to live in the Middle Ages? We can see the three different estates that are in the Middle Ages, or the three different social classes. The idea of estates or orders was encouraged during the Middle Ages. First, you have the clergy. Now, Latin is chiefly spoken and written between them. These are the people who are going to pray, and their purpose was to save everyone's soul for God. Next, you have the nobles. For them, they chiefly speak the French language, and these are those who fight in order to save their kingdom. Their purpose was to protect, to allow for all to work in peace, and to provide justice in the land. The next one you have is the commoners, and that would be English spoken, and that would be for those who work. Their purpose was to feed and clothe everyone above them. Now, when we look at what type of society it was built around, essentially the economic system was called feudalism. So the economic system of much of the Middle Ages from about 800 to 1100 at this time, and the commoners or the peasants lived on a feudal manor. Now, the lord of the manor, or the noble, gave his vassals, the peasants, land to farm. In return, the vassals received protection from roving bandits, yet they were taxed and had to surrender a portion of their crops to the lord. Obviously then, as a noble, it was better to be a lord than to be a vassal or a commoner. Now, feudalism at this time is important because it created ties of obedience, and it fostered a sense of loyalty between the vassals and their lord. When we bring the clergy into the fray, we look at how they provide guidance through the well-known precepts of the 7 deadly sins. So they're supposed to help save your soul by getting rid of pride, greed, wrath, envy, gluttony, sloth, and lust. Now, when we look towards the end of the Middle Ages, known as the High Middle Ages, it begins with the First Crusade in 1095. And here we want to reclaim Jerusalem from the people who currently live there. This also will open trade routes along the Middle Ages and start moving us towards the Middle Period and into the Renaissance. Now, the peasants or the vassals are liberated from their lords to fight and die in the Holy Lands, and then cities will now start springing up along the Crusade routes. At this time, because you see a lot of the peasants going off to fight in the Holy Lands and going off and starting to bring the cities along the Crusade routes up, feudalism begins to die out, and the transition into that Renaissance begins. Now, before this time period, in the Dark Ages, the church provided structure to society, not only with their religion to save souls, but also by providing a menial education as well. Sadly, with the Crusades, the church becomes very powerful and incredibly corrupt. We see popes fighting for political power over who gets to be the next pope, and greed is very rampant among all the clergy. They will sell indulgences. In other words, they'll say, if you want to save your soul, you need to give the church money. Now, the Crusades are also being fought for money. Not only are they fighting for the Holy Land in order to say that it is rightfully for Christians, but they're also going to then fight for the other physical lands where their trade routes are going to start up. Now, you can see this in our literature of the Canterbury Tales. Now, with the Crusades, when people come back to England, they will bring the Black Death. This is going to spread along the trade routes to and from England into the Holy Land, and it kills much of the population. The plague outbreaks occur through the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance. Yet, paradoxically, the plague provides for continued growth in cities. Afterwards, there are hundreds of new jobs available, so the vassals or the peasants who no longer want to work on lords' properties can actually come into the cities to find a job. As well, many debts are going to die off with the creditors. Maybe the family members, the older family members had debts, and as they die, those debts do not get handed down to the children. This is also going to contribute to society's culture as we see a movement of people into the cities and into different countries. However, you're also here to learn about the literature during the medieval period, not just the history. So let's start with the language. Once again, Latin was the language of the Roman Catholic Church, which was dominating Europe at the time, and the church was the only source of education. If the wealthy wanted to have their children have some sort of menial education, you had to look to the church for teachers. And thus, Latin is going to be the common language for medieval writings. The commoners couldn't read anyways, they would have heard the stories passed down orally. Now, a great amount of medieval literature is anonymous. Medieval authors often tended to retell and embellish stories they heard rather than to invent new stories. We also look at Catholic clerics being the intellectual center of society in the Middle Ages. After all, they're one of the few that are educated. And it is their literature that was produced in the greatest quantity. But let's start looking at the characteristics of medieval literature. Some not within the church would write what we call romances, and that is a narrative in prose or verse that tells of the high adventures and heroic exploits of the chivalric heroes. Remember, at the time the Crusades were going on, and so people wanted adventure and romance. It's also going to tell of exploits of knights in their kingdoms, and often there's a supernatural element involved. Some sort of magic is being used by the villains, or you are being helped up by some supernatural power from the past. And of course, knowing that the clergy are some of the most educated, some of the most prolific literature in medieval literature is going to have a Christian message. It has a concern with salvation and the world that is to come, and there is no interest in this Christian message of social change, only of spiritual change. And this is going to be true even throughout a lot of the Renaissance, up until the late 14th century. You're going to see this begin to die out as we see more commoners coming into their education and writing, such as Geoffrey Chaucer and Dante Alighieri, that are going to signal new thinking and try upending the social order within their literature. Some of the characteristics of medieval literature you're going to see is heroism, both in the Germanic and the Christian traditions, and you're going to sometimes mingle both of those together. So you're going to see in some of our earliest novels with the romances, you're going to have heroes such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You're also going to see heroes fighting Beowulf. You're also going to see in the Nibelungenlied and the Song of Roland, these great heroes that are going to come to help the commoners. There are also presentations of idealized behavior, where literature is supposed to be teaching a moral lesson. Again, for most of the commoners, stories are being handed down orally, and so you're trying to teach a sense of moral or social behavior. You also are going to see those being written out by the clergy and by the nobles. And so a lot of these moral lessons are going to be showing loyalty to your king and a sense of chivalry in the upper class. You also have the use of kennings, which is a figurative language that is usually a compound expression used in place of a name or a noun. For example, instead of saying a battle, you might use the kenning, a storm of swords. The use of allegory is also quite prevalent. An allegory is a figurative mode of representation conveying a meaning other than the actual literal meaning. Now, much of medieval literature relied on allegory to convey the morals that the author had in mind while writing. Now, these are representations of abstract qualities, events, or even institutions that are thick in much of the literature at this time. For example, if you read Dante's Inferno, Geoffrey Chaucer, a lot of these representations are going to be showing a little bit of the social behavior, whether it is chivalry and loyalty to the king or asking for a different change in society. But let's look at the conventions of medieval romance. First, we'll focus on three medieval romance texts. The influence of medieval romance with its roots in epic poetry, the winds through the English literature and through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, even into the literary romantic movements, and of course, even modern takes. So where does the romance start? Well, first of all, you often have unprovoked and violent fighting. There has to be adventure. There has to be a reason to become a hero. Usually your medieval romances are set in a dark, mystical place in time, and usually before the medieval period, probably in the Dark Ages. There is always going to be supernatural elements and magical powers from the pagan world. After all, these are going to be Christian heroes and Christian social members, so they have to fight off pagan ideals. Like, for example, you can see your knight here is fighting off a dragon. Certainly, you have to have a hero who is on a noble adventure or a quest. And because of that, you're going to have a loose episode-like structure, where you're going to have downtimes where the knight is perhaps not fighting, but perhaps now he's going to go off and talk to the maiden. You are certainly going to include elements of courtly love, whether or not that is us showing loyalty to our king and love of our country, or it could be, again, the romance, like looking for the maiden. It certainly should embody ideals of chivalry. Usually these are the upper class who are going to show that they are ready to fight for commoners, they're ready to fight for the good of the kingdom. And usually you have a time frame of a year and a day. For some reason, they want to make sure that they cover an entire year in their story, and then at the very end, you get some time pushed into the future, that last day that hero is either going to have a sad, tragic farewell, or they have won out the day, perhaps won the hand of the maiden, and all is well. Now let's look at courtly love and the chivalric code. Now chivalry is from the French word chevalier, meaning a horseman or a knight. Now the code of chivalry influenced the formation of religious military orders during the period of the Crusades. The now famous Knights Templar and the Hospitallers are among the most noted knights among this period. Now during the later Middle Ages, chivalry had become largely as a system of manners for knights and a source of entertainment during tournaments, which themselves gradually became less threatening to the participants than actual live battle on a battlefield. And we're going to see the chivalric code obviously have military virtues, but they're also going to combine with Christian values. We're going to see that if you have chivalry, you should have temperance. You should not be drinking alcohol. Fortitude, you are always prepared. Prudence, you are always going to be kind and gentle. And a sense of justice, you're always going to do what is right. With the Christian virtues, you have faith, hope, and charity towards others. You should have valor and strength in battle. After all, you are going to be some sort of knight or some sort of hero. There certainly should be loyalty to God and King. Even in the face of your enemies, whether they are a supernatural pagan element or they are another knight, you're always going to have courtesy towards them. You are always going to be nice towards them until the battle begins. Of course, there's always generosity towards those who need help, such as the sick, women, widows, the oppressed. You are always ready to defend them. And of course, next we get into courtly love. Now, courtly love is a relationship that was modeled on the feudal relationship between a knight and his lord. The knight serves his courtly lady with the same obedience and loyalty which he owes to his lord. Now, the ideal of this woman being a lady in the court, she's in complete control, and the knight owes her his complete obedience and submission. Now, the knight's love for the lady inspires him to do great deeds for her in order to be worthy of her love or to win her favor. Now, courtly love is not going to be seen between perhaps like a more modern day ideal of a husband and wife, because it was an idealized sort of relationship that could not exist within the context of real life medieval marriages. Now, in the Middle Ages, marriages amongst the nobility were typically based on practical and dynastic concerns rather than on love. You were going to see marriage matches made. People generally did not marry for love. So courtly love is something that you are showing loyalty to. You are showing that they are upper class to you, therefore you are going to protect the ladies, or you are showing love towards your lord because you are loyal to your kingdom. You're not thinking about a love being like a husband and wife kind of love. That was really not existent in medieval marriages. So courtly love provided a model of behavior for a class of unmarried young men who might otherwise have threatened social stability. Knights were typically younger brothers without land of their own, and hence they were unable to support a wife. So they became members of the household of the feudal lords whom they served, usually another relative, but they could also move on to another land just to hopefully get themselves a wife on that particular land and serve that lord. Now, the lady that they are going after for courtly love is typically older. She's typically married to somebody of the nobility, and she's of a higher social status than the knight because she was modeled on a wife of a feudal lord, who might naturally become the focus of the young, unmarried knight's desire. Now, the literary model of courtly love may have been invented to provide young men with a model for appropriate behavior. In other words, it taught bored young knights to control their base desires and to channel their energy into socially useful behavior. So you should love service rather than wandering around the countryside stealing or even raping women. Now, the symptoms of love were described as if it were a sickness, and that's where we get the word lovesick. A lovesick knight's typical symptoms were sighing. He would turn pale or turn red at the sight of this lady. He would have an inability to sleep, eat, or drink, and might even feel a fever if he was in love or lovesick. The other major element that we have besides courtly love in these pieces of literature is the quest. So in addition to the theme of courtly love, the quest was highly important to medieval romance. With this, the code of conduct observed by the knight errant who is wandering in search of deeds of chivalry. This knight is bound by a code of behavior, a set of conventional principles and expectations that he is to follow throughout. Now, a quest is a hero's journey towards a goal. The objects of quests require great exertion on the part of the hero and the overcoming of many obstacles. Now, the heroes must obtain something or someone by their quest, and then with this object return home. Now, usually there's an inner problem and an outer problem for the character. Perhaps the inner problem is they are lovesick, and so therefore they must go on and find an adventure. An outer problem could be, again, that supernatural element. Maybe they have to go fight a dragon. Maybe they have to go fight a different knight in a different country. Now, the hero is introduced and the audience completely identifies with them immediately, because not only is the hero going to show chivalry, but the hero has to lack something. They have to have a tragic flaw that the reader or the audience is going to connect with. Now, the call often produces disorientation and discomfort for the hero. Sometimes we have a reluctant hero. He doesn't believe he can go off and do everything he's asked to do, or he's going to stumble across a big obstacle. And this call is often in the form of a dire warning. Again, it could be a supernatural warning. Maybe the lady that he is trying to win the love of is going to give him a warning that this is a hard quest. And so because of this reluctant hero, there's going to be excuses that can be used to avoid the call. And this hesitation illustrates the formidability of the challenge that's ahead. We have to make the challenge seem tough, or we're not going to believe the knight is a hero. Now, this resistance creates change and strength that's going to allow your hero to grow. Here's your developing character. Now, with that supernatural element we usually see in the Middle Ages, a physical or a metaphorical crossing needs to be made. So we need to leave our country. We need to cross a lake or cross some sort of bridge. And the crossing is an irrevocable leap of faith from which there's no turning back. You are on your quest. Once there, the hero is going to face their greatest fear, and the hero dies, usually figuratively, not literally, so they can be reborn and gain a new perception. Now that might give him a moment of clarity and a great self-realization for the hero. This is the change and the growth that the hero needs. It could be also an epiphany for any of the hero's sidekicks or companions. So when the hero faces his greatest fear, maybe perhaps he loses the first battle, but then recollects himself and goes back and wins the battle. Maybe he gets lost. Maybe he loses something, like maybe he loses one of the hero's companions and he goes back for revenge. But there has to be some sort of facing of fear. There has to be some sort of figurative or literal death. And then we go towards the challenge again after we have that moment of self-realization. So when we look at the medieval hero, they're often of a divine descent and endowed with great strength and ability, or they are a man admired for his achievements and noble qualities. Sounds like a modern hero, doesn't it? Maybe some that we see drawn and illustrated. Maybe some that we see in the MCU or DC Comics. But let's take a look at a couple of examples from medieval literature instead. Perhaps the Song of Roland. Now this is the oldest surviving French medieval romance epic, and the Song of Roland will be the first medieval text that usually you'll explore together in classes. Either that or else it would be Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. And that's because they're both written around the same time, around 1140 to 1170 AD for the Song of Roland. But this one actually tells of the events that occurred on August 15th, 778 AD. Now, with the Song of Roland, the story is told in the poem that is based on a historical incident, the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass on the 15th of August, 778, in which the rear guard of Charlemagne's withdrawing Franks, the French forces, are escorting a rich collection of plunder that was gathered during a campaign in Spain. And here, on August 15th, it was attacked by pagans or non-Christians. Now, in this battle, recorded by historian and biographer Eginhard in his Life of Charlemagne, written around 830, every one of the trapped soldiers were slaughtered, including Roland. But before Roland's honorable death in battle, he shows the reader the stages of the hero's journey and many heroic archetypes. He demonstrates what it means to be a chivalrous knight, loyal to his king and country to the very end, overcoming his own character flaws and sacrificing himself for the greater good in the end. His story is the embodiment of the greatest medieval romance that was ever written. Thanks so much for stopping by to learn about medieval literature and a little bit about medieval history. If you'd like me to go through more medieval literature, say you'd like to learn about Beowulf or about Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales or even Dante's Inferno, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what other videos I can make for you. And always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.